I've got a question for you. Do you think the world is better off or worse off than it was, say, 10 years ago? I've got a lot of thoughts on that, starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Is the world getting better or getting worse? Think about that. Obviously, there are two possible answers to that question. Some of you will say that things are getting worse, and some of you will say that things are getting better. So, which is it? We are all unique, so your personal experiences will influence the answer to that question. If you're going through bad times personally, you will say things are getting worse, and if you just got a great new job, you'll say things are getting better. But to answer the question, I want you to put aside your personal situation and think about all of society. Are we better off or worse off than we were 5 years ago, 10, 20 years ago? It's a difficult question because it depends on what we mean by worse off. I think we can all agree that humans in general are better off today than we were 500 years ago. We have indoor plumbing and medicine, and most of us will live past the age of 40, so that's pretty good. But what about comparing today to the more recent past? Let's talk about extreme poverty. A human living in extreme poverty doesn't have enough food, doesn't have adequate shelter against the weather and natural disasters. Children have to work, they don't have enough time for adequate schooling or even playing, and there's not enough medicine. That's what extreme poverty is, and for most of human existence, extreme poverty was the source of most human suffering. In 1800, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. Here's a multiple choice question for you. In the last 20 years, the proportion of the world living in extreme poverty has A, almost doubled, B, remained more or less the same, or C, been cut in half. The answer is that the proportion of the world living in extreme poverty has decreased by about a half in the last 20 years. In 1800, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. 20 years ago, it was 20%, and today it's around 10%. 10% is not acceptable, but it's the best level in human history. If you use extreme poverty as the metric to judge the well-being of humanity, over the last 220 years, or 50 years, or 20 years, it's obvious the world is getting better. One of the consequences of extreme poverty is a high rate of child mortality. Since the beginning of time, it was very common for children to die before reaching their 5th birthday. We don't have accurate numbers, but it's estimated that in 1800, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. It didn't matter where in the world they were born, the child mortality rate was very high. That doesn't surprise you, I'm sure. So let me ask you another question. What do you think the child mortality rate was in Canada in 1950? Now, 1950 was after the end of World War II. Canada was a prosperous country. Penicillin was discovered in 1928 and was being widely used in Canada to treat infections by the late 1940s. So what was the child mortality rate in Canada in 1950? It was about 5%. That was still a high number, but obviously a significant improvement since 1800. So what about today? What's the child mortality rate in Canada today? The most recent data I could find was for 2015, and Canada's child mortality rate was 0.5%. That's still an unacceptably high number, but that's a 100-fold decrease over 65 years. But what about other countries? In 1950, the average child mortality rate in France and Germany and Italy was around 6%, only slightly higher than the rate in Canada at the time. Today in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and Egypt, the child mortality rate is 4% or less. That means there are many countries in Africa today that have child mortality rates less than the rates in many countries in Europe in 1950. And yes, there are countries in Africa with higher child mortality rates. The DRC, Niger, Mali, and South Sudan are around 11%, and Chad and the Central African Republic are at 14%. But those countries were around a third in 1950. So even though their child mortality rates are unacceptably high, they have improved considerably from where they were a few decades ago. What are children dying from today? The largest cause of child mortality, 45% of deaths were from infectious diseases. That's a scary number, but there is hope because most of those diseases are preventable. We now have a measles vaccination. The number of measles cases has shrunk by 86% since 1990. The World Health Organization estimates that between 2000 and 2017, measles vaccination has prevented over 21 million deaths across Africa. These are preventable diseases, and that should give us hope. Speaking of vaccination, that's a big topic in the media today with all of the anti-vaxxers out there. So here's another question for you. How many of the world's 1-year-old children have been vaccinated against some disease? Pause the tape and think about it. I'll be more specific with the question. What percentage of the entire world's 1-year-old children, including all the poor countries in the world, received the third dose of the combination vaccine that protects against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, which is whooping cough? Canadians were actually asked this question in a survey back in 2017, and the average Canadian said the worldwide vaccination percentage was 30%. Americans said it was about 35%. So what percentage did you guess? The correct answer is 85.8%. We Canadians think that only 30% of the world's children have been vaccinated, but the world has had a vaccination rate of over 30% since 1983. Yep, our answer is almost 40 years out of date. In some respects, we have no clue what's happening in the world. You probably know that smallpox was eradicated in 1980 due to the smallpox vaccine. That's a huge success story. What about measles? In Canada, in 1986, there were almost 15,000 reported cases of measles. That's 1986, not 1886. That's not that long ago. In 2019, the full data isn't in, but it looks like it will be less than 100 cases of measles in Canada. Today, due to improved living conditions, nutrition, and medical advancements, including a measles vaccine, measles in Canada is virtually non-existent. Worldwide, same thing. Since 1980, from close to 1,000 cases per million people globally to 28 cases per million today. That's a 33-fold reduction. And yes, I'm recording this in December 2019, and I've heard the news, and while Canada is doing well, in November 2019, cases of measles have tripled compared to the same period in the previous year, with the most cases recorded since 2006 in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Samoa, and Ukraine. So there are setbacks, but that proves the point. There are solutions to our problems if we take action. Okay, so I've made my point. Health-wise, both Canada and the world are a lot better off than we were just a few years ago. But what about the economy? This podcast is about money, not health. Ted and I will be doing our annual prediction show next week, and we'll go through all of the numbers and see how accurate we were with our 2019 predictions and give our predictions for 2020. So if you're into the numbers, tune in next week. The numbers, if you believe them right now, look good. Each province is different, but the unemployment rate in all of Canada right now is under 6%. In the 1980s, it peaked at 13%, and in the 1990s, it peaked at 12%. And as recently as 2010, it was 8%. So over the last 40 years, the unemployment rate in Canada has consistently declined. The unemployment rate in Canada hasn't been this low since 1975. Isn't that good news? Well, it depends who you ask. Some people will say, yes, obviously, lower unemployment is good news. But other people will say, well, wait a minute, you got to look a little deeper. There are lots of people who are no longer looking for a job. They've given up, so they don't count as unemployed. There are lots of other people who are underemployed. They work a contract job or a temp job or a part-time job or 2 part-time jobs, so they're not unemployed, but they're not as well off as someone else who has a full-time permanent job. There are lots of people with jobs but no benefits and no job security, so they aren't unemployed, but they aren't doing well. Okay, so there are 2 sides to the story, but for most people, the unemployment rate is at a better level than in the past. What about interest rates? Well, back in 1981, the interest rate on a conventional mortgage was well over 21%. The interest rate on a 1-year conventional mortgage bottomed at under 3% in 2015, and today it's around 3.64%. So compared to the period between mid-2015 and mid-2017 when interest rates were at their all-time low, interest rates are higher today than they were at the bottom, but they're still significantly lower than they were at the peak. And yes, I get it. If you're a saver, you may not think low interest rates are a good thing, and you may have a valid point. But again, looking at the big picture, the economy appears to be doing well. Now, I know what's going to happen when this podcast is released. Some of you are going to go on Twitter and say, well, sure, the numbers look good, but there's more to life than just focusing on things that can be measured. Life is more than just numbers. Okay, you can't measure the impact of the value of the 3 F's, faith, family, and friends. There are lots of problems in this world that can't be measured. Life is more than just an accounting exercise where we crunch the numbers. That's true, and I agree. Life is a lot more than just numbers, but since I'm an accountant and don't have any way to quantify those non-numerical factors, I'm going to stick to the numbers just to make my point. So let's get back to the original question. Is the world getting better or not? Well, if you look at health and welfare indicators like extreme poverty and child mortality rates and vaccination rates, and if you look at economic indicators like unemployment and interest rates, it sure looks like the world is better off today than it was in the past. So if the world is getting better, why do we think things are getting worse? Why do we underestimate things like worldwide vaccination rates? There's a great book on this subject. It's called Factfulness: 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think, by Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling was a medical doctor and a professor of international health. He spent many years working in public health in many different countries. He died in 2017 and spent the last few years of his life crunching the numbers and working on this book. The stats I quoted earlier about extreme poverty and child mortality and vaccination rates all come from his book and his work. I'll put links to his work in the comments to this video on YouTube so you can fact check me. Bill Gates said this is one of the most important books he's ever read, and Melinda Gates said that this book explains why progress is so often secret and silent. Why is that? Why are things better than we think? Well, obviously, based on the title of the book, you know that in the book he gives 10 reasons. I'm not going to go through all of them now, but I'll put a link to the book in the notes for this video on YouTube so you can get the book and read it from there. But I will tell you reason number 2 from his list of 10 reasons. The negativity instinct. For many of us, our brains are wired to remember recent bad events, and we forget older good events, which gives us this constant illusion of deterioration. Think about it. If someone cut you off on the road today, that may put you in a bad mood, and you use that recent experience to conclude that all drivers are bad drivers, when in fact you've driven thousands of miles without getting cut off, but you forget those positive experiences because they aren't recent. And if 2 weeks from now someone else cuts you off, you're going to say to yourself, see, it's happening again. Everyone is a bad driver. We forget the good times, remember the bad times, and if all you remember are the bad events, it makes it seem as though bad things keep happening and things keep getting worse. Okay, that makes sense, We evolved as humans to be very aware of bad things because bad things can kill you. If the last time you saw a lion it killed your friend, you will remember that negative event so that you can be extra alert the next time you see a lion so you can stay out of its way. We are afraid of lions, but we aren't afraid of birds because birds, unlike lions, are unlikely to cause us any serious physical harm. If you've ever seen a lion in the wild, you'll probably remember it, but you probably can't remember the last time you saw a bird. We are programmed to remember the negative because avoiding danger helps us survive. Okay, now we get to the good part of this podcast. We humans are more alert to the negative. We have a negativity instinct because that helps us survive. So, here's a question for you. If you were going to start a TV news channel and you wanted lots of people to watch it so you could sell a lot of advertising and make a lot of money, what kind of news channel would it be? Would it be a good news channel where you report on all the good things that happen in the world? Would you cover the latest statistics that show that extreme poverty is falling and that world health is increasing? No. If your objective was to make money, you know that good news is not profitable. We humans are drawn to the negative news because that's how we are programmed for survival. You've heard the saying about news coverage, if it bleeds, it leads. Try this experiment. Turn on the news and see what the first story is. It's probably coverage of war or a murder or a car crash or house fire or some horrible crime or some political scandal. Go to any of the news sites on the internet and write down the titles of all of the stories on the homepage and then rate the story as good news or bad news. I actually tried it this morning and about 80% of the stories were reporting on bad things that have happened. The top stories are almost always negative. Not always. Sometimes something really good happens, like when the Raptors won the championship, and that was a good news story for many days. I remember it well because during the 2019 playoffs, when the Raptors were winning, almost all of my clients who came in to meet with me were in a better mood than normal. Didn't matter. Male, female, all races, all ages, almost everyone was caught up in the good news because it was not normal. Normal is bad news. So why do we think the world is getting worse? Because that's what we see on the news and Twitter. So what's my point? What's the point of today's podcast? I'm an optimist. Yes, the day-to-day news is bad. Yes, there are people suffering, but I believe our problems are solvable if we put our minds to it. 500 years ago, there wasn't enough food. 220 years ago, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty and there was no hope. But today, most humans have food and access to shelter and vaccinations, and as a result, very few humans starve to death or die of preventable diseases. Yes, some people do die of preventable diseases, but humanity has largely solved our physical problems. In the past, our problems were physical, tangible, like lack of food and lack of shelter. Today, many of our problems are mental. Now, I know I'm going to get crushed on Twitter for saying that, but think about it. What's your biggest worry today? Famine? Smallpox? Measles? Not having shelter from the weather? Getting eaten by a wild animal? Not enough food? Extreme poverty? Those were the main problems for all of human history, but today we have largely solved them. Our problems today are in our heads. Now, that does not mean they aren't real problems. Of course they are. Stress is a very real problem. I meet with clients every day who are worried about whether or not they'll be able to afford a house or whether they'll be able to escape part-time and contract work and find a permanent job that's, well-paying and has benefits. Those are real problems, but I believe they are solvable. 200 years ago, a respiratory ailment like pneumonia was a death sentence. There was no hope. Today, we can fix it. 100 years ago, starvation was a real problem, and there was no solution. We weren't physically capable of producing enough food to feed everyone. It took a full day's work for one person to get enough food to feed their family, and some days there was no food. Today we have amazing farming technology, and one farmer can feed hundreds of people. There are more people today that are obese than hungry. We humans have made amazing progress. I think a lot of our stress is caused by the negative inputs we get. Twitter can be very negative. The news can be negative. Facebook can be negative. And that negativity causes us stress in our heads, and that makes us think things are getting worse when in fact we humans are actually doing a good job to make things better. So, how can you control the negativity instinct? How can you make your mental world a better place? Well, first, whenever you see or hear bad news, remember that bad news is more likely to be reported than good news, so you are getting an unfair view of the world. Make it a habit to seek out good news, or at least seek out both sides of the story. I've done a lot of media interviews this year where I've been asked to comment on what's happening in the economy. Almost every week there's a new survey that comes out that says most Canadians believe they are $200 away from insolvency. Okay, there are over 37.5 million people in Canada. Let's assume, 10 million of them are kids with no debt. So to be conservative, perhaps there are 25 million Canadians who could potentially become insolvent. Half of them feel that they are $200 away from insolvency. Formal insolvency means you have filed a consumer proposal or personal bankruptcy. That means there could be 12 million bankruptcies next year? No. In 2019, maybe we'll hit somewhere between 135 and 140,000 personal insolvencies, which still isn't as high as the number we hit back in 2009 at the height of the credit crisis when the population of Canada was a few million less than it is today. So while the number is growing, it is nowhere near as high as we feel it is. We succumb to the negativity instinct and think things are worse than they are. Seek out the facts. That's why my firm, Hoyes Michaelis, issues studies where we crunch the actual numbers. So while surveys are useful for telling you what people think, they aren't very valuable for telling you what is actually happening. For that, you have to look at the numbers. The second way to not get sucked in by negativity is to not rely entirely on your memory. We humans tend to think that the past was perfect and rosy, but that's not true. There were bad times in the past, and I've given you lots of examples today, so don't trust your memory. Look up the facts. Let me conclude by saying this. Yes, I know we have problems, and they are real problems. The world is not a perfect place. Ted and I will talk about it more next week on episode number 278, so please hit the subscribe button on YouTube or in your podcast app so you don't miss it. Insolvencies in Canada were up a lot in 2019, and there were some very serious warning signs on the horizon for 2020. But I'm optimistic because there are strategies you can employ to deal with those problems. That's the whole point of the Debt Free in 30 podcast, practical strategies to deal with real life problems. So if you're looking for a New Year's resolution for 2020, how about this? Don't blindly believe everything you hear. There are usually two sides to every story, so seek out the other side and you may find things are not as bad as they seem. That was the point Hans Rosling made in his book, Factfulness, and that's the point I made in my book, Straight Talk on Your Money. I said that we make most of our decisions based on emotion, not facts, and that can cause lots of problems. Problems, yes, but I believe they are solvable. I'm an optimist. That's our show for today. Thanks for watching and listening. Stay tuned next week for our big year-end summary and predictions podcast. Until then, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.